night it started, I was alone, as usual. My apartment, usually a refuge, felt like a tomb. It was 2:44 a.m. when the first whisper snaked through the silence, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the wind, nor the creaks of an old building settling. This was something else entirely. It was my name breathed out low and ragged right beside my ear. A chill, unlike any winter night in Boston, seeped into my bones. A cold that felt ancient and wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. I live alone. I had locked the door, every window was latched. So who or what had just whispered my name? My breath hitched in my throat, hot and dry. I'm Zara, a content writer by trade, though these days my words feel hollow, inadequate to describe the horror I've witnessed. I've always been the quiet one, preferring the company of books to people, and my small, 2-bedroom apartment has been my sanctuary for the past 2 years. I moved here, to the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts, seeking solace after a tragedy that left me with a limp and a permanently fractured sense of reality. My perpetually frayed nerves, a constant hum beneath the surface, usually made me dismiss strange occurrences as products of an overactive imagination. But when I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to rationalize this intrusion, trying to dismiss it as a phantom, the silence in the room was no longer just silence. It was a suffocating, heavy blanket pressing down on me, amplifying the frantic thrum of my own pulse. And when I opened my eyes, I knew. This was no trick of the mind. This was real. And it was here. I wish I could say this was the first unsettling thing that had happened to me. But it wasn't. My life, for as long as I could remember, had been punctuated by these inexplicable flickers of the bizarre. Growing up, I was the kid who saw shadows where there were none, heard whispers in empty rooms, and felt a cold dread that others couldn't comprehend. My parents, bless their hearts, attributed it to an imaginative mind, a sensitive nature. Therapists suggested anxiety, a touch of paranoia. I learned to live with it, to compartmentalize the unsettling occurrences, tell myself they weren't real, just my mind playing tricks. But this felt different. This was a violation, a direct intrusion into my perceived safety. The whisper had been so clear, so intimate, as if spoken by someone who knew me, someone who was standing inches away. My gaze darted around the room, propelled by a primal fear. The familiar objects of my living room, usually comforting in their predictability, now seemed alien, imbued with a sinister potential. The armchair in the corner, a mound of blankets draped over it, looked like a hunched figure. The closed blinds, usually a shield against the outside world, felt like a thin veil, easily pierced. I felt an inexplicable urge to look behind me, even though I was already pressed against the wall, my back aching. It was the feeling of being watched, an intense, burning gaze on the back of my neck. My throat was so tight I could barely swallow. I tried to call out, to make any sound, just to break the oppressive silence, but my voice was trapped. All that escaped was a pathetic gasp. My eyes scanned the room again, frantically searching for an anomaly, a sign, anything that could explain away the terrifying whisper. The faint glow of the digital clock on my nightstand showed 2:44 a.m., the numbers stark and unblinking. I had been reading a thick novel about a historical mystery, trying to lose myself in another world, another time. Now the book lay discarded on the floor, a forgotten casualty of my sudden terror. A shiver, not of cold, but of pure, unadulterated dread, crawled up my spine. It felt like icy fingers, tracing a path from my tailbone to the nape of my neck. My apartment, a small, 2-bedroom unit in an old building on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts, had always felt safe, if a little lonely. I had hoped for quiet, for peace. Instead, it seemed I had walked right into something far more unsettling than my past. The air in the room grew heavy, stagnant, as if all the oxygen had been leached out of it. I could taste something metallic on my tongue, the coppery tang of fear. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. My eyes, wide and unblinking, continued their frantic search. And then I saw it, or rather I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the shadows near the closed bedroom door. It was so subtle, a mere trick of the light perhaps, but my terror-addled mind interpreted it as movement. Someone, something, standing there just beyond my sight. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but remain paralyzed in my bed. My limbs felt like lead, my muscles locked in a rigid grip of fear. My past trauma, the lingering guilt, the constant anxiety that hummed beneath the surface of my daily life. It all felt amplified, magnified by this unseen presence. Was this a manifestation of my own fractured mind? Was I finally losing it, succumbing to the creeping darkness I'd always felt lurking at the edges of my sanity? Or was something truly there, something tangible and malevolent? A cold draft, impossible, in the sealed room, brushed against my cheek, sending another wave of goosebumps across my skin. It carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent, something acrid like old damp earth, mixed with something else, something sweet and sickly like decay. My stomach churned. I squeezed my eyes shut again, pleading with myself, whatever unseen force was in the room, for it to be over. Just a dream, a hallucination. Anything but this crushing, undeniable presence. When I opened my eyes, the shadow by the door seemed to have solidified, deepened. It was still indistinct, a darker patch against the already dark wood, but it felt denser. And then slowly, agonizingly slowly, a sound began to emanate from it. A low, guttural hum, like a distant whisper trying to force itself into speech. It was the sound of my name again, this time elongated, stretched. A grotesque parody of my own voice, vibrating from the shadow itself. My own voice, on a phone I never touched. No, this was worse. My own voice coming from a corner of my room where nothing should have been. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was an invitation. And I knew, with a horrifying certainty that chilled me to my very bones, that if I responded, if I even acknowledged it, my nightmare would truly begin. Atmosphere, unease, and foreshadowing. I lay there rigid with terror, the echo of my own twisted name still reverberating in the stale air. The shadow by the door remained, a blot on the canvas of my sanity. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply. Every instinct screamed at me to pull the covers over my head, to hide, but a perverse fascination, born of sheer terror, held me captive. My gaze was fixed on the indistinct shape, willing it to disappear, to dissolve back into the benign darkness it had once been. The apartment, usually a haven of quiet, now felt like a giant, echoing chamber. The usual nighttime symphony of distant traffic and the hum of the refrigerator had vanished, replaced by an unnerving silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, that felt alive, teeming with unseen things. I could almost hear the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the blinds, each tiny particle a silent witness to my unfolding horror. And then, Just when I thought my heart couldn't possibly beat any faster, a new sound emerged from the oppressive quiet, a faint, rhythmic scratching. It seemed to come from inside the walls, a soft, persistent rasp, like nails dragging across old plaster. My past, which I had tried so desperately to outrun, began to flood my mind. I had always been the quiet one, the observer, the one who preferred the company of books to people. After the accident, a car crash that took my younger brother Omar and left me with a broken leg and a permanently fractured sense of reality, I became even more withdrawn. The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy cloak draped over my shoulders. I was driving. I survived. He didn't. The whispers, the shadows, the cold dread, they had intensified after Omar's death. I used to think they were manifestations of my grief, my guilt. Now I wasn't so sure. Was this a punishment? Was something feeding off my sorrow, my isolation? The scratching grew louder, more frantic, a flurry of tiny movements behind the wall directly opposite my bed. It was rhythmic, almost like a code or a heartbeat, a tiny, rapid heartbeat. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered a conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Zaidi, a kindly old woman who lived downstairs. Old buildings, she'd sighed, shaking her head. They have their own little secrets. Always some creaking, some scratching. Mice, mostly, or the settling of the foundation. But this wasn't the tentative scuttling of a mouse. This was insistent, deliberate. My eyes flickered to my bedside table. The old analog clock, a gift from Omar, sat there, frozen. The hands were stuck at 2:44. It had been working perfectly yesterday. A chill deeper than any cold draft seeped into my bones. Coincidence? Or another thread in a rapidly tightening net? I remembered, too, how my beloved houseplant, a thriving monstera I'd nursed for years, had suddenly withered and died within days of my move here. Its leaves had turned black, crispy, as if scorched by an unseen fire. I'd blamed it on a lack of sunlight, a new environment. But now the memory felt ominous, a subtle warning I had ignored. My building, once a comforting relic, now felt like a living, breathing entity, its very walls imbued with a sinister awareness. The smells, usually a faint mixture of old wood, and the spices from Mrs. Zaidi's cooking were now tainted. That acrid, earthy odor, mixed with the sickly sweetness of decay, seemed to emanate from the very air itself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. A sudden, sharp rap echoed from the window pane. Rap, rap, rap. 3 distinct taps. My head snapped towards the sound. My window was on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing an ordinary person could stand on. Yet the tapping was undeniably there, close, insistent. My blood ran cold. Was it a bird? Branch? No, the sound was too deliberate, too heavy for either. It sounded like knuckles on glass. My immediate neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Khan, usually kept to himself. He was a quiet, unassuming figure, always dressed in neat, if slightly faded, clothes. But lately I'd noticed him acting strangely. I'd seen him late at night, standing outside his apartment door, just staring at the wall. Once, he'd turned, and his eyes, usually kind and roomy, had been utterly devoid of expression, like black pits. He hadn't said a word, just stared through me. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his lips had curled into a faint, unsettling smile before he turned back to the wall. I dismissed it as an old man's quirks, a touch of senility. Now the memory sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Had he seen something? Known something? Was he, too, a victim? Or something far worse, The tapping on the window intensified, becoming a frantic, scratching sound, as if something was desperately trying to claw its way in. I could almost visualize sharp, brittle nails scraping against the glass. My breath hitched. The shadow by the door seemed to writhe, elongating slightly as if it were reaching. I could feel its unseen gaze, a heavy weight on my chest. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. And it was here, in my apartment, pressing in on me from every direction. The rhythmic scratching from the walls, the sickening smell, the impossible tapping on the window, and the terrifying shadow in the corner, humming my name. I was trapped, a fly caught in a monstrous web, and the spider was just beginning to stir. The scratching on the window reached a fever pitch, a desperate, frantic sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the silence. My eyes, still locked on the unmoving shadow by the door, darted to the window. The thin blinds offered no protection, no solace. I could almost feel the vibrations of whatever was clawing at the glass, a persistent, chilling rhythm that mirrored the frantic beating of my heart. My own voice, elongated and grotesque, continued to hum from the shadow, a lullaby of dread. Suddenly a crack spiderwebbed across the window pane, darting from the upper corner and snaking its way down, an icy tremor through the glass. My breath hitched. It was impossible. There was nothing outside but air, 3 stories down to the deserted street. Yet the crack widened, then another appeared, and another, until the entire pane was a mosaic of fractured glass. I could feel a cold draft, laced with that acrid, earthy smell, seeping through the widening fissures. The shadow by the door seemed to pulse, to darken, as if energized by the breaching of my sanctuary. Then the true horror began. The fragments of glass, instead of falling inward or outward, began to shift. They didn't break completely, didn't shatter. Instead, they slid against each other, grinding with an unholy shriek, reforming into grotesque, shifting patterns. It was like watching a kaleidoscope of pure fear, and within the shifting shards, I saw it. Not a reflection of my room, not the street outside, but a distorted, murky image of something else. Something dark and indistinct, a swirling vortex of shadows and malformed shapes. And in the very center of that swirling chaos, for a fleeting moment, I saw a single, unblinking eye. It was black, bottomless, and filled with an ancient predatory hunger. My mind reeled. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. My grip on sanity felt tenuous, like a thread about to snap. Was I hallucinating? Was the trauma of Omar's death finally manifesting into full-blown psychosis? The line between reality and nightmare had not just blurred, it had dissolved completely. The room itself seemed to waver, the familiar walls breathing, the furniture subtly shifting its form. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on my chest, until it felt like an elephant was sitting on me. From the shadow by the door, the humming intensified, growing into a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards, through my very bones. And then, a word, stretched and distorted, emerged from the hum. Come. My own voice, yet utterly alien, stripped of all humanity, dripping with an unsettling invitation. It was the sound of a predator luring its prey. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence with a primal cry, but my throat was still locked. My eyes, however, betrayed my terror. They were wide, unblinking, fixated on the window, where the eye had just vanished, replaced by the chaotic dance of glass fragments. And then, slowly, impossibly, the glass began to repair itself. The cracks reversed, the shards knitted back together, the grinding shriek fading into an eerie silence. Within seconds, the window was whole again, pristine as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen. The eye, the shifting shadows, the palpable evil. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached my ears, closer this time, as if breathed directly into my earlobe. "Don't look." It was still my voice, still that grotesque parody, but the words were distinct, chillingly clear. "Don't look outside, not at 2:44. My heart seized. Outside? My neighbors? The memory of Mr. Khan standing motionless outside his door, his eyes like black pits, his unsettling smile flashed through my mind. Was that what this was about? Was it a warning or a trap? The thought was a jolt of icy electricity. The shadow by the door began to expand, to stretch. It wasn't just a darker patch anymore. It was forming, coalescing. A gaunt, elongated arm, impossibly thin, reached out from the gloom, its fingers long and spindly, tipped with nails that seemed too sharp, too dark. It wasn't reaching for me directly, but towards my bedside table, towards the analog clock stuck at 2:44. A wave of nausea washed over me, a dizzying sense of disorientation. The room spun around me, not physically, but as if my perception of it was being twisted, warped. The furniture seemed to stretch, then shrink. The walls rippled like water. My own hands, clutched tightly to the blanket, looked alien, enlarged, then shrunken like a funhouse mirror reflection. My sense of time, too, was fractured. Minutes felt like hours, then seconds. Was this a curse, madness, a ghost? Or something far more ancient, something that played with the very fabric of reality? The elongated arm from the shadow reached the clock. Its spindly fingers, like black talons, hovered over the face, and then, with a barely audible click, the hands of the clock began to move, not forward but backward. Slowly, agonizingly, they spun counterclockwise, past 2:43, past 2:40, speeding up as they went, a dizzying reversal of time. The shadow pulsed faster with each tick. The scratching in the walls intensified, becoming a frantic, tearing sound. As the clock's hands whirled backward, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible, keening sound filled the room, growing louder, more piercing. It was a sound of immense suffering, of unbearable agony, a sound tore at the very core of my being. And then with a final shuddering click, the clock stopped. The hands were frozen once more, not at 2:44, but at 1:11 a.m. The keening stopped, the scratching in the walls ceased. The shadow by the door retracted, shrinking back into an indistinct blot. The air cleared, the heavy metallic scent fading. The room was silent once more, but it was a different silence now. A hollow, desolate silence, filled with the echoes of what had just transpired. I was left alone, trembling, my mind screaming with questions. What had just happened? What did 1:11 a.m. signify? And as a fresh wave of bone-chilling dread washed over me, I knew, with absolute certainty, that this horrifying episode was far from over. The silence that followed was a physical entity, pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. My limbs still felt like lead, but the paralysis of terror had been replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. My mind, however, was in overdrive, replaying the impossible events, the fractured window, the shifting reflections, the black, unblinking eye, and the clock, ticking backward to 1:11 a.m. The apartment was still, too still. The usual nocturnal sounds of the city seemed to have been muted, leaving me in a pocket of profound, unnerving quiet. I slowly, cautiously sat up. My muscles protested, stiff and aching, as if I'd been holding a single, terrifying pose for hours. My eyes darted to the clock. 1:11 a.m. The digital display on my nightstand, however, still glowed 2:44 a.m. My head throbbed. Which was real? The one that had been tampered with by an unseen, malevolent force? Or the one that had merely witnessed the horror? The question hung in the air, a cruel, mocking whisper. My gaze drifted to the window. It was whole, pristine, as if the spiderweb cracks and the shifting, terrifying reflection had never existed. But I knew what I had seen. The memory was seared into my mind, a chilling snapshot of the impossible. The window was a lie. This entire apartment felt like a carefully constructed illusion, a stage for a nightmare I couldn't escape. A profound sense of unease settled over me, a pervasive dread that was different from the sharp, immediate fear of moments before. This was a deeper, more insidious horror, one that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the thin walls of my apartment could no longer keep the darkness at bay. The encounter had not ended peacefully. It had simply retreated, leaving behind a lingering residue of pure malevolence. I remembered the whispers of my own voice, distorted and cold. Don't look outside, not at 2:44, and the terrifying implication of Mr. Khan, standing motionless, his eyes empty. Was he a victim compelled to stand guard? Or was he something else entirely? The thought sent a fresh shiver down my spine. The unanswered questions were a torrent in my mind, each one a sharp, painful jab. What was that shadow? What did it want? Why 2:44 a.m.? And what did 1:11 a.m. signify? I stumbled out of bed, my legs wobbly beneath me, and walked towards the living room, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The air here felt colder, heavier. My eyes immediately fell upon the old, ornate mirror that hung on the wall, a flea market find I'd always loved. It was dusty, its silvered surface dull, but I had always found comfort in its antique charm. Now it seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible light. I walked closer, drawn by an invisible thread. And then I saw it. My reflection. But it wasn't quite right. My eyes in the mirror were wider, darker, filled with a terror that surpassed my own. And behind me, in the reflection, standing just where the bedroom door would be, was the shadow. Clearer this time, more defined. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form almost like a distorted human silhouette, but with no discernible features, just an abyss of darkness. Its arm, that long, spindly limb, was extended, reaching out towards my reflection, and in its hand, reflecting in the mirror, was the analog clock, now clearly showing 1:11 a.m. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see the shadow looming behind me. But there was nothing. Just the familiar, empty space of my living room, the closed bedroom door, and the unmoving digital clock on my nightstand, still proudly displaying 2:44 a.m. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was still there, reflected clearly behind my own horrified image. It wasn't in my apartment, it was in the mirror, and it was holding the clock that marked the impossible time. A chilling realization dawned on me, cold and unforgiving. The shadow wasn't just an entity that visited me, it was connected to me. The whispers in my voice, the way it mimicked me, the distortion of my reflection, it was feeding off something. My fear, my trauma, my guilt over Omar's death. This wasn't just a random haunting. This was personal. This was a parasite, inextricably linked to my very being, twisting my reality, blurring the lines between my internal turmoil and the external world. The lingering impact of this revelation was profound. The paranoia that had always simmered beneath the surface of my life flared into a full-blown inferno. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to hold a hint of the entity. Every creak of the old building became a potential whisper. I started sleeping with the lights on, the glow of the lamp a small, desperate defiance against the pervasive darkness. But even with the lights, I could still feel it. A cold spot in the room, a subtle shift in the air. My world, once predictable if lonely, was now a constant landscape of dread. I found myself checking the time obsessively, my eyes flitting between my digital clock and Omar's old analog one, which I now kept hidden in a drawer, terrified of its impossible hands. I started avoiding my neighbors, especially Mr. Khan. I would hold my breath when passing his door, my gaze fixed firmly on the floor, remembering the chilling warning. Don't make eye contact. I knew with a certainty born of pure terror that if I met his eyes at 2:44 a.m., I would see not his reflection, but something else entirely, something from the other side of the mirror, and that if I did, I would never truly be able to come back. My immediate story was resolved, but the resolution was a twisted, unending torment. I had survived, but I was not whole. I was merely a vessel, carrying a piece of the nightmare within me, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The night I heard my own name whispered from the shadows, my world didn't just crack, it shattered. It's been months since that first terrifying encounter, and the silence in my apartment is no longer a comfort, but a deceptive blanket over a deeper, more chilling truth. The lingering mysteries from that night remain, like phantom pains in a severed limb. What was the significance of 1:11 a.m.? What was the entity's true nature? And why me? These questions echo in the hollow chambers of my mind, a relentless torment. I learned a lesson that night, etched into my very soul with icy fear. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and once opened, they can never truly be closed. I survived that night, yes, but the survival feels less like a victory and more like a prolonged sentence. The silence after it was gone was the loudest sound of all, a deafening roar of absence that confirmed its presence. The trauma of Omar's death, the guilt that had always clung to me, was no longer just an internal struggle. It had become a beacon, a raw wound, drawing something ancient and malevolent from the unseen corners of existence. This wasn't about gore or jump scares. It was about the profound, soul-deep loneliness that became a fertile ground for a horror I couldn't comprehend. I am not haunted by a ghost. I am haunted by a connection, an inescapable bond to something that thrives on my isolation and my sorrow. I still live in that apartment, too paralyzed by fear and a strange, morbid curiosity to leave. Every night, as 2:44 a.m. approaches, a knot of icy dread tightens in my stomach. I pull the blinds, I turn on every light, and I try not to look at the analog clock, now carefully tucked away in a locked drawer. But the fear is a constant companion, a cold hand on my shoulder. And then there are my neighbors. I still avoid Mr. Khan, but now I understand. When I glimpse my other neighbors through my peephole at odd hours, walking their dogs or taking out the trash, I actively avoid meeting their gaze, especially if the clock approaches 2:44 a.m., because I know with absolute certainty what happens then. The other night I woke up to a faint, shuffling sound outside my door. I held my breath, my heart pounding. I crept to the peephole, pressing my eye to the tiny lens. And there, in the dim hallway light, stood my neighbor, Mrs. Zaidi, a kind, gentle woman who always offered me tea and sympathy. She was standing perfectly still, facing away from my door, towards the wall opposite. Her back was ramrod straight, and as I watched, her head slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to turn. Her neck craned, twisted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see her face, but I saw her eye in the reflection of the glass-covered fire alarm on the wall. It was not her eye. It was black, bottomless, and utterly devoid of life. It was the eye from the fractured window. I pulled back from the peephole with a strangled gasp, stumbling backwards, my hands pressed to my mouth to stifle a scream. The cold dread returned, sharper, more defined than ever. I knew then that it wasn't just inside my apartment, it was outside. It was in the building. It was in the very air of this place. And it was waiting for someone to make eye contact. So, if you ever find yourself awake in the dead of night and you see your neighbor standing outside at 2:44 a.m., don't make eye contact. Don't acknowledge them. Don't even breathe too loudly, because the silence that follows might be the last sound you ever hear. And the face looking back at you might not be your neighbor's at all. It will be the eye from the other side. And it will be waiting for you. Always.